It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. The Prime Minister hits back at Elon Musk.
Those that are spreading lies and misinformation as far and as wide as possible, they're not interested in victims, they're interested in themselves.
The world's richest man has also fallen out with Nigel Farage, shortly after the Reform leader praised him.
I'll tell you what he gives us. With huge numbers of young people, he makes us look cool.
So how should UK politicians respond to Elon Musk? Also today, the government unveils a plan to cut NHS waiting lists. Will it work? And can this government get economic growth going again in 2025? With me today, Labour MP Jake Richards, Conservative MP John Lamont, Rachel Cunliffe from the New Statesman magazine and Harry Cole of The Sun. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome back. The first Politics Live programme of 2025. And the richest man in the world is looming large over UK politics. Elon Musk has strongly criticised Keir Starmer and the Home Office Minister Jess Phillips over the last few days and this morning, partly in response to Jess Phillips rejecting a request from Oldham Council to launch a government inquiry into historical child sexual exploitation, saying the council, not the government, should lead any inquiry. And Elon Musk has criticised the Prime Minister and Jess Phillips for that decision, and also Keir Starmer's record as the head of the Crown Prosecution Service. Let's just take a look at some of the tweets. This one first. In the UK, serious crimes such as rape require the Crown Prosecution Service's approval for the police to charge suspects. Who was the head of the CPS when rape gangs were allowed to exploit young girls without facing justice? Keir Starmer, 2008 to 2013. Then there's this. Who is the boss of Jess Phillips right now? Keir Starmer. The real reason she's refusing to investigate the rape gangs is that it would obviously lead to the blaming of Keir Starmer, head of the CPS at the time. He goes on in another tweet. Prison for Starmer. And then this. America should liberate the people of Britain from their tyrannical government. That was one of the two tweets sent overnight and this morning. Well, Keir Starmer has hit back. Let's have a listen.
We've seen this playbook many times, whipping up of intimidation and threats of violence, hoping that the media will amplify it. Now, Jess Phillips does not need me or anybody else to speak on her behalf. But when the poison of the far right leads to serious threats to Jess Phillips and others, then in my book, a line has been crossed. I enjoy the cut and thrust of politics, the robust debate that we must have, but that's got to be based on facts and truth. Not on lies, not on those who are so desperate for attention that they're prepared to debase themselves and their country.
Your reaction, Jake, is that going to stop Elon Musk tweeting about UK politics and the Prime Minister?
Well, look, I don't think anything any of us say will have any effect on what Elon Musk does. He will do what he wants. What we need to do is have a proper response to this. As a political body, all politicians united in pointing out when Elon Musk is saying complete falsities, lies about our country, lies about our Prime Minister. And there's a role too for the media as well, if I may, in also making sure that they point out that this guy is unhinged, he's dangerous, and he's telling lies to 230 million people overnight about our country, and we need to stand up to him, because bullies will only be dealt with if you stand up to them. And that, if I may, just briefly, Kemi Badenoch has yet to criticise Elon Musk about some of the things he said, and I hope that changes this morning.
Yeah, what do you say? Because perhaps you want to embrace Elon Musk for congratulating the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, for calling for this government inquiry into historic child abuse in Oldham.
So the facts are that Elon Musk will, in a few days, become part of the American administration. So he has an important international role. some of his language has been completely unacceptable. The fact that some politicians in this country are now under greater protection as a consequence is also unacceptable. But in many ways, all of that is a bit of a distraction. The spotlight should be on the failure of this government to have a nationwide inquiry into these grooming gangs and the horrific impact it's had on the victims of these gangs. That is the main issue here. Elon Musk has put a spotlight on that, notwithstanding that he's used unacceptable language and his conduct has been unacceptable, in my view. The issue that I think we should be discussing, I'm sure we'll come on to that later, is impact on the victims and the failure by the state to properly address the impact these gangs are having in many communities across the United Kingdom.
Jake?
Well, I agree that this issue of child sexual exploitation is a huge one and one that needs to be tackled. Before being elected, I was a barrister working in child protection law, so I know these issues inside out. In 2022, when the Conservatives were in power, there was a big review into this. 6 million pieces of evidence, hundreds, thousands of witnesses gave evidence to that, and 20 recommendations were made.
You're talking about the Alexis J.
The J
inquiry.
report in 2022. How much progress was made on those recommendations on the Conservatives? Nil progress. Now, in my view, the job of the government is to get on with those recommendations, put them in place, and let's take action to stop these heinous and horrible crimes taking place anymore.
John, why weren't any of those recommendations put in place?
So the last government and previous governments should have done more on that issue. I fully accept that.
Or anything, it seems.
But the last inquiry was too broad, in my view. We are dealing with very specific allegations around gang rapes, grooming gangs, and other allegations affecting very particular communities. That inquiry covered all sorts of things, including
so it was
allegations
the wrong sort of inquiry.
It was too broad. The calls now, and the call that I'm making and my Conservative colleagues are making, is for a much more targeted inquiry into the impact on those communities, the 50 or so communities across the United Kingdom who are being affected by these grooming gangs and the effect they're having on their victims and the communities more broadly.
Right, just before I go on to our other guests, you said something in your previous answer which is interesting, is that Elon Musk has shone a spotlight on this issue that you are very keen to pursue. Is it right then to conclude that without Elon Musk's intervention, the Conservative Party or Kemi Badenoch, the leader, would not have brought up this issue? It's taken the intervention of Elon Musk for you to actually realise that this is an extremely important issue.
No, the reality is the last Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, set up a task force to try and address some of these issues. I think the challenge for the mainstream media, if I may say, is prompted, Elon Musk using his platform has prompted this discussion more broadly in the mainstream media. Had he not made that intervention and some of his very extreme and unacceptable remarks, would we be talking about it now? I suspect not.
Right, OK. Well, then that means perhaps you hadn't shone a spotlight on it enough yourselves. If we can just go back to Elon Musk briefly, I mean, how much of an influence is he going to have on UK politics?
So I think he's very much setting himself up as the main character of both US and UK politics for the beginning of 2025. But a couple of caveats. Elon Musk is not British. He doesn't really understand Britain. He certainly doesn't understand British law. If you read his tweets, they sort of read, I don't know, called tweets anymore, his ex-posts, sorry.
We know what you mean.
They read like a sort of 16-year-old kid who's discovered a Reddit thread about how the UK works and is absolutely outraged on all of that. He's had it in for Keir Starmer since the summer when he got involved in tweeting about the riots and British free speech law, which, again, he clearly doesn't understand. He seems to think that Tommy Robinson, the far-right agitator who's currently in prison, is some kind of political prisoner, when that's very much not what his conviction is about. So I think Elon Musk is a liability for British politicians of all parties. We've seen that over the weekend with how quickly he can sort of turn and change his mind, because he doesn't understand our country, he doesn't understand our laws, he doesn't understand what's going on. And any British politician that goes, Elon Musk has a point here, is just setting themselves up to be utterly humiliated.
Harry?
Yeah, look, I think you can look at this from multiple angles. One, yeah, the deranged rantings of an aspiring Bond villain, or this is the most successful entrepreneur, world famous man that literally pulls rockets out of the space with giant chopsticks.
And he's going to be part of the administration.
Going to be part of the Trump administration, and he's made the only electric car that anyone actually really turns their head to ever look at. And, he is obviously an incredibly successful person. his politics, I think, are a bit ropey. And what gave him currency in this country, what made him interesting, I think, was this dangled 100 million rumoured donation to reform. And his closest to Nigel Farage, and whether he'd be another one of these sort of unofficial diplomatic back channels to the Trump administration, which every country in the world is trying to work out how to access. But now he's kind of blown that up now because he's turned on Farage.
Well, let me just show you then the Daily Telegraph. Indeed, those words. Musk turns on Farage, says he's no longer fit to be leader of Reform UK. And I think there's just one more headline to give you another flavour. The Guardian. Musk says Reform UK needs new leaders. He takes aim at Farage. So is he a help or harmful to...
Well, actually, I think it's quite helpful to Farage at this, actually, because Nigel Farage has spent the last 15 years trying to distance himself and any movement that he's running from Tommy Robinson and the EDL and that horrible fringe of politics in this country. And if Musk thinks that Tommy Robinson is a more popular figure in the UK than Keir Starmer or Nigel Farage, he is just frankly wrong. Where I do get worried about Musk's tweets is when it comes to business, when he is talking down Britain, when he is saying we are a backward, over-regulated country that no one would want to invest in. That's when he does actually know what he's talking about. And that's where it gets dangerous.
I think the question that arises following the fallout with Farage is how long will the relationship that Musk and Trump continue? I mean, I suspect Trump and Musk will fall out in due course.
Well, you'll be hoping so, obviously.
And then his currency becomes much less relevant then as well.
It's 100% going to blow up because neither Donald Trump nor Elon Musk can handle being the sort of sidekick, the backup character. And in fact, you can already see it's fraying. And I think from a British diplomatic perspective, we need to remember who's actually going to be in the White House. And we need to forge relationships with that team, not with the guy who's currently flavour of the month, but is clearly going to be out of favour in a matter of months, I'd say.
Would you like to see the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, go further in his criticism in the way that you have done of Elon Musk?
Well, Keir Starmer's Prime Minister, I'm a backbench MP. Slightly different roles.
Slightly
different roles, Joe. But no, I think Keir Starmer was right at his press conference this morning.
It's taken him a while, though, hasn't it?
But he shouldn't be distracted by this guy. You know, Keir Starmer is running the country. He's got huge challenges, which I'm sure we're going to go on to talk about. I don't think he should be on X or Twitter or whatever we call it, checking what Elon Musk has said every 2 hours. That's not the right priorities. He needs to be getting on with the job in hand, which is what he was doing, talking about the NHS this morning.
Well, let's go back to the issue itself at the heart of this debate. And that is Oldham Council calling for a government inquiry into historic child abuse. One of you mentioned the Alexis J report that was done. It was a very comprehensive report. It took into account grooming gangs in various towns across the UK. It also looked more broadly at child sex exploitation. Why is the government rejecting? Is it the right decision to reject that call now for a government inquiry into this issue? Well,
there's two things. First of all, the last government rejected the original call, and Jess Phillips, the relevant minister, has said that it's not the right thing to do at the moment. You know, I repeat the point, Joe. We had a massive report published just 2 years ago. None of those recommendations have been implemented. That work has yet to be done. We can't just keep having reviews, inquiries into this horrible, serious, complex issue.
Why?
We
Why
need
not?
action.
If it's that important.
Because, Joe, action is what is needed now. For victims that have already are struggling to get justice in our criminal justice system, which too often fails victims. For vulnerable children now who are at risk of exploitation. We can't waste 2 years having another inquiry. We can't waste a minute. We need action. And if I may, Jess Phillips is one minister, regardless of your politics, Labour, Tory, Reform, whatever, is someone who really understands this issue, has worked in the sector for decades before, and is moving in haste on these issues. And I think that's what people really need now, is government action, less talking.
Right. Do you agree with that?
So it's important. First thing, going back to the Oldham request, the previous Oldham Council request, it was not a request by the full council. What Jess Phillips has rejected this time was a formal request from the full council for this inquiry. The previous request, which the Conservative government rejected, was a request from one councillor on Oldham Council. It was not a request from the full administration, and that's an important distinction to make. I think in terms of and also that other inquiry was still ongoing at that stage.
What I'm trying to put to you is action more important than having another inquiry, implementing the recommendations. Baroness J herself has shown frustration and disappointment that none of those recommendations have actually been implemented. And you can see here, Child Sexual Abuse Inquiry Chair urges government to act, that's this government, on the basis that previous Conservative governments didn't.
So I've already accepted we need to do more to implement the recommendations of that report. But the other point, which the victims and the families and the wider communities affected are also making about that inquiry, is it's not targeted enough on these these grooming gangs and what is going on in those dozens and dozens of communities across the United Kingdom, where this problem is still persisting. You cannot take action until you understand the full extent of the problem.
Right. Do you think there is some sense in looking again specifically at grooming gangs, this part of awful child sexual exploitation that obviously has occurred? We've had convictions, we've had cases, and we've had this inquiry, but there is still a real fear, it seems, that it is ongoing.
Yeah, I think the main point of any inquiry is not just to cast blame around. It's not just a sort of cathartic group therapy process. It is about making sure that the harm that happened can't happen again or isn't still happening. And I think as long as there are concerns that any of the absolutely despicable behaviour and the state failures that were part of this scandal are continuing, there is an argument for a nationwide inquiry and for an inquiry that looks at all the different towns where this was going on and tries to draw links between all of them. I do think, though, the focus has to be on the victims. It has to be on people who are possibly potentially still being harmed now, and not on turning those victims into a political football. And I found it very distasteful how the Conservatives and Labour and Reform are all kind of throwing around, you were the government then, well, you're the government now, you didn't do anything, you were safeguarding minister, and it takes it away from what the real purpose should be, which is making sure that young girls aren't still being harmed in this way.
Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, it is being politicised. I mean, that's what this is all
about.
Yeah, I mean,
Keir Starmer this morning, basically spent the entire morning trying to make it about Kemi Badenoch and only Kemi Badenoch, and he said basically anyone that, accusing her of getting on the coattails of the far right.
I mean, she was women's minister.
There are millions, but there are also millions of people in this country who are furious about this and would like to see another inquiry. And to sort of, what's made me slightly uncomfortable about Starmer's comments this morning were he slightly tarred everyone with the same brush. That anyone that's calling for a further inquiry is amplifying the far right. Well, that's these are the sort of excuses that were used originally.
He didn't say that, Harry.
He did say that. He did say that. I've got the quote because I had it out with Downing Street before I came on this show about it, because he said they were getting on the coattails and amplifying the far right. The problem is that it's exactly the same sort of language that was used to originally not even investigate this thing. I'm not accusing Keir Starmer of doing that. He did do a lot at the CPS to turn the ship around on this. But there hasn't been a moment of national reckoning of this story, this scandal, the way it was bundled up with the rest of the Alex J report. They looked at 6 towns, not the 50 towns that it's been reported in. The British public, large parts of the British public would like to see show trials rather than another inquiry. There's so much anger out there, which I don't think the politicians have realised is festering and needs to be lanced, essentially.
Well, I agree with Harry that there is a lot of, and rightly, a lot of anger out there about what has happened and what still happens across the country, not just in 50 towns, by the way, across the country and across the world. These awful crimes happen. We had the J report, we had the Casey report, we now have the latest report in 2022. I mean, we can do more reports, but I want to see the government take more action.
But what about...
And I think that is the priority. And may I just add, sorry to interrupt, Jo, but local-led reports and inquiries are often much more effective. We saw that in the Rotherham with Jay and Casey, which focused on the town, working out what happened, what went wrong. There have been huge improvements in Rotherham since then, which should be acknowledged. But having another report at this point is... I'm not quite sure what it achieves when we need action now. Right.
What about the point that Keir Starmer referred to anyone raising these issues in that way is amplifying the far right?
Well, Jo, I don't accept that. I don't accept that's what the Prime Minister was saying this morning.
Was he talking
that
about
anyone who calls... Rachel just said there's a good case for a national inquiry, and I accept that there is an arguable case for one. Of course, we should always keep this under review.
Would you like to see one?
No, at this point, I'd much prefer to see the government implement those recommendations, and some of those recommendations are really important. If I may, Jo, before working, I represented a young girl who was raped by her father, and when she went to try and get some compensation from the criminal compensation scheme, she got the same as you would if she'd broken her leg as a result of a criminal act. Now, that is what this review is recommending, one of the many recommendations, reforming that part of the law. Now, let's get on with that, so that young victims are properly compensated. They can never be fully, but properly compensated for these heinous crimes. Let's get on with that rather than another talking shop.
But surely we need to be making an intervention to stop the crime happening in the first place. I agree the compensation is part of it, but we need to be, the government, the state needs to be doing much, much more to make an intervention to stop these types of behaviour happening in the first instance.
Right, I mean, this is the latest tweet, which I think has just dropped from Elon Musk. Starmer was deeply complicit in the mass rapes in exchange for votes, talking about difficulties within local communities. And that's why, in fact, I think the Prime Minister referred to difficulties that should be exposed historically in communities. That's what the inquiry would show. What's your response?
Well, look, we have to, all of us have to condemn these messages because it's not good for our politics. It's not about Labour, Tory, Keir Starmer, Kemi Badenoch or anything in the past. We've got someone who is publishing comments to 250 million people saying that our Prime Minister is complicit in mass rape. Let's kind of step back, recognise what is happening. Let's call it out for what it is, which is lies, disinformation and trying to bully our country. We can't let it happen. I hope the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrats and Reform join that call today.
Right.
Well, and he's also calling for, running a poll, calling for America to invade the United Kingdom and doesn't seem to understand that while many people, both in the UK and across the world, may be unhappy with the Starmer government so far, they are a democratically elected government and generally democratically elected governments get to have a go at running the country. That's kind of how democracy works. He's sort of calling for new elections. He's calling for the US to get involved in our politics. I think any British politician, again, of any party, whether they support Keir Starmer or not, should be horrified by some random tech billionaire saying we should invade your country because we don't.
I mean, as we all know, social media is a sewer of misinformation. There's people spreading falsehoods and lies about all of us on this platform, I suspect, and that's just how it works. There's a bigger question about how we regulate social media in the comments, but the days of people only getting their news from the mainstream media, the BBC or the Times, whatever newspaper, well, indeed, have gone.
But it should impact how British MPs respond to Elon Musk, that he has made those comments about our democracy.
But on this particular issue, in terms of the grooming gangs, I mean, as I said at the start of this discussion,
you want to pick and choose which comments are worth looking at?
is a distraction from the substance, which is the victims of these terrible crimes, which is what we should be talking about. Elon Musk has highlighted it for reasons only known to himself, but we should be addressing the concerns that are being raised.
Well, can I get you to react and comment on these remarks that have been made by Robert Jenrick, Conservative MP, who also had a response to this. The scandal started, the grooming scandal, with the onset of mass migration, importing hundreds of thousands of people from alien cultures who possess medieval attitudes towards women, brought us here. Do you agree with that?
Well, some of the issues that have arisen and are ongoing in many communities across the United Kingdom are, in my view, totally unacceptable because of the attitude they have towards women. I mean, some of these crimes
What
that
does
are being...
he mean, people from alien cultures?
Well, not. I mean, aliens are a term of a legal term, which means not UK culture. So there are cultures around the world where types of. So, for example, in some cultures around the world, it's acceptable to marry more than one woman, which is clearly not acceptable in this country. So some people come to this country with that background, with that history, and it would be wrong for them to carry on trying to lead that type of lifestyle in the United Kingdom. That is a point that Rob is trying to make.
This is a good example of what we were discussing earlier, using this issue as a political football, I'm afraid. We all know that Robert Jenrick is still fighting the leadership contest that he lost a few months ago, and he's using language purposefully to try and
people who
get a reaction.
People who come to this country.
No, I'm not saying that Robert Jenrick's. I'm not saying Robert Jenrick's underlying point doesn't have some weight. In fact, I think it does. And it's really important that we look into it. But the language he uses, the way he makes this argument, needs to be handled with real sensitivity.
It does, but this is the problem. The second anyone says it, they get accused of either playing politics or being racist or being, insensitive. Someone's got to say it finally, right? And he has. And it wasn't part of a leadership election, because the first thing I saw was your instinct when I saw those comments, when he's really going for it, he's freelancing, there's no way with this signed off. And actually, Kemi Badenoch came out last night and defended it.
But don't you think that's interesting?
She has to defend it now.
Well, no, but I think the reality is these things need to be saying, and for too long they haven't been said, and we're reaching a stage now in British politics where, you can say it.
I think that's really interesting, because there definitely was a time not too long ago where a Conservative backbencher, obviously he's not a backbencher, but a Conservative backbencher making those kind of comments using that kind of language would have been immediately condemned by the mainstream of the party and possibly expelled. He has been endorsed by Kemi Badenoch as leader.
The public have woken up to this issue.
I think it says something about the direction the Conservative Party is moving in.
I think it says direction where this country is moving.
But you agreed with the sentiment of what was being expressed there. So, I mean...
But 10 years ago, ago, the sentiment that was, I think, is being expressed there was part of a national report, an inquiry that we had. The Casey report said exactly what he's trying to say, but in a much more measured, careful way, and we've known this for decades, so let's get on and act upon it.
All right, well, let's talk about something completely different, and that is the NHS and the NHS reform plan, very much at the heart of the government's agenda. The Prime Minister was at an event introducing it. Let's have a listen.
We will also move care closer to their lives, shift treatment away from hospitals and centres and deliver more care at their GPs, in their community and in their homes. And you gave me some brilliant examples of what a difference that makes, shifting care towards people's communities and their homes this morning when we're walking through what you do right here. Because, as you know, that will make a massive difference to waiting times. If we can get more GPs consulting immediately with specialists, diagnosing even more quickly, then we'll avoid an extra 800,000 unnecessary referrals and appointments every single year.
Let's talk to the BBC's health correspondent, Nick Triggle. Hello to you, Nick. Just expand a little bit more about what is at the heart of the government's plan to reform the NHS.
Well, this, Sir Keir Starmer said, was the plan to end NHS backlogs. Their election manifesto said they'd get back to hitting the 18-week waiting time target. And what we've got today is more detail on this. First of all, currently less than 60% of patients are seen within 18 weeks. By March 2026, they want to ensure that gets up to 65% before the end of the Parliament, when it reaches 92%. Now, to achieve that, he's talked about expanding the network of community diagnostic centres so people can get their tests and scans nearer to where they live. He's talked about opening up more surgical hubs. These are centres away from hospitals where we know this winter A&E departments are under strain and that fills up beds. These surgical centres, surgical hubs are away from the hospitals, which should mean they should be able to do more operations and treatments. He also wants to give patients more choice over where they can go for their treatment. The idea being that they can see where the waiting lists are shortest and then choose to go to those places to get their treatment. And he believes this will not only increase capacity, but make the NHS more efficient and help reduce the waiting times that we currently see.
That's the ambition, Nick. Will it need more staff, an expanded workforce to deliver it?
Well, that is one of the things doctors, leaders are pointing out. Of course, these new hubs, diagnostic hubs and surgical hubs need staff. And we know from a report last year that one of the things that's limiting the amount they can do and the hours they can open is the availability of staff. There's also question marks about patient choice and whether patients actually want to travel to get treatment. Patient choice has actually been around since the Blair government, and yet only a quarter of patients seem to be exercising choice at the moment. So question marks remain about how effective that policy will be as well.
Nick Triggle, thank you very much. So at the heart of this plan being announced today, Jake, is wanting to cut the number of people waiting more than 18 weeks for planned treatment on the NHS. How is it going to be achieved when you've got 7.5 million people on the waiting list and there are the sorts of nursing shortages being predicted by the Royal College of Nursing themselves for this year?
Well, it's a huge challenge. It's ambitious, but it's one that we've got to meet. We've got 7.5 million people waiting for NHS treatment. We've got to get those waiting lists down.
How?
Well, firstly, the Prime Minister set out today a huge increase in capacity. So we're getting the NHS running 7 days a week, weekend hours, overtime and weekdays. We've invested £22 billion into the NHS that was announced at the budget. This will take time. This is not easy. The Prime Minister was very upfront about the challenge this will be for the NHS, the staff that we do have, the staff that we will be recruiting. But clearly, this will take time, but it's so important for our country.
Right, but how can you expand the service before you've got the staff?
Well, because you can, first of all, have NHS operations working 7 days a week. You can have pay for overtime, people working longer hours. Yes, that's difficult. It's not easy. But this is what we have to do to get the NHS working again.
Right, and you embrace all of this. I presume there's nothing in there that you don't disagree with.
So I think the big challenge for the government, speaking as a MP from Scotland, is you hear all these things from the Scottish Government about improving access and reducing waiting times. And part of that is about recruitment. And if you look at the GP network in my own constituency in the Borders, GP practices are struggling to get GPs and nurses, and recruitment is a big, big problem. So government have very big ambitions in terms of reducing waiting times, but recruiting doctors and nurses to general practice and also to more provincial hospitals is very, very challenging. Yes, the big cities and big towns can get the staff, but for smaller towns across the UK, it is a big, big problem in terms of GP access and staffing hospitals. So we hear very big claims and aims from the government, but how they're going to deliver it without being able to recruit and increase staffing, I just don't know.
I mean, how big a risk is it to raise expectations so high, we've seen it time and again, and not meet them?
Well, actually, the expectations that we're setting aren't as high. When Labour were last in government, we had waiting lists going much further down. I think we can do even better than this in the long term.
Well, I'm talking relative to what people are experiencing now.
You have to be ambitious. You have to set ambitious targets to get the NHS working again. And that's what this government will do. And look, John's right. There is a huge challenge about recruitment in towns rather than the cities and in rural areas as well. But what I haven't heard from the Conservative Party is anything on the NHS since Kemi Badenoch has been leader. I don't think she said a single thing. And they criticise the budget every day. We hear them on social media and in the House of Commons criticise the budget. But do they support £22 billion of investment in the NHS? If they do, how are they going to pay for it? We've complete silence from the Conservatives on the second biggest issue for people in the country.
Do you support the £22 billion going into the health service?
Well, I mean, we always support additional investment in the NHS, and we had the last Conservative government had a very proud record of investing in the NHS, particularly during the pandemic. But our job as the opposition is to hold the government to account and ask them the tough questions.
Even when you agree with the investment going in?
Well, as Kemi has said, she is rebuilding, renewing the Conservative Party. We've still got 4 years until the next election. We will set out in our manifesto at that time what our specific policies are. But as the opposition, our job is to hold the government to account and ask the tough questions.
Cutting the NHS waiting list to within 18 weeks has been an official NHS target for some time. Hasn't been met since 2015. What advice would you give this government then on how to achieve it?
Well, hopefully the new government won't have the same challenge that we had in terms of dealing with the COVID
pandemic.
Was 2015. Yes, but 2015 to now, in the intervening period, we had the pandemic, which completely knocked the NHS off. Of course, I know from the conversations I have with my local NHS teams, they are still dealing with the recovery from the impact of that pandemic. And the new government, I still think, will have big challenges in terms of moving forward as a consequence of that.
Right. Do you think it is deliverable? I mean, we're in the middle of winter. And there's already enormous pressure, as there always is, on the NHS. Is it deliverable?
So I think this part of the plan is the low-hanging fruit part. I want to say something in defence of community diagnostic centres, which is the sort of core of this part of the policy. I've got a chronic health condition. I have to get blood tests every 6 weeks. I don't go to a hospital. I go to my local community diagnostic centre. It's working for me. The average time between me getting through the door and leaving again is 7 minutes. I've timed it. And it's so much simpler and more straightforward and more patient-focused than going to a hospital, and also cheaper and easier to run than hospitals. So if you can get people going there and extending the hours, you are quite literally helping patients, making the experience better for them, and you're also making progress at the diagnostic end, which is really important, because if you look at things like our cancer stats as a country, the reason our figures are so poor is not because cancer care is bad, it's because of issues and delays with diagnostic. You know, at the beginning, people not getting the tests as soon as possible. So this is a really important part of fixing the NHS. I do think, though, it is the easy part. The hard part is, what do you do about hospital capacity? What do you do about beds? And what do you do about, you know, dozens of ambulances queuing up outside hospitals? They can't offload patients, long waits in A&E. And the reason they can't offload patients and the reason there are such long waits in A&E is to do with social care. And that is an issue where the government has made a conscious decision to kick the can down the road to 2028.
We'll come back to that in just a moment. In terms of the experience, the positive experience that you've had, and no doubt many of our viewers will have had too. But to go back to the point that John raised about regional differences, I mean, it may be easier in certain parts of the country. Is it as easy to have these sorts of diagnostic centres and that sort of proximity when you're rolling it out across the country?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I mean, obviously they've been rolled out for a couple of years now, and they seem to be working, you know, well. And it's just as Rachel said, this is low-hanging fruit. It's the common sense stuff. Yes, it should be open 12 hours a day. Yes, it should be open 7 days a week. Yes, the NHS app should be able to, you know, work and be linked up with your GP and all these things like that. Yes, you should be able to. The GP should be able to refer you straight to tests. This is the basics. This is what the NHS should be doing. Before the election, Keir Starmer and Wes Streeting, particularly, made some big, bold promises about how only Labour could reform the NHS because of their historic relationship, the founding party of the NHS, the party of the NHS, the Tories want to sell it to Donald Trump, all that nonsense we've heard for the last 20 years. But where is this? I was totally underwhelmed so far by Labour on the NHS. Wes Streeting, nice guy, talks a good game. But he is, we all know he's got lofty aspirations beyond being Health Secretary. But unless he starts to pull his finger out a little bit, he's going to be in real trouble here, because they have made a lot of promises. One of the major reasons the Sun endorsed Labour before the last election was because of those promises that finally someone was going to be able, not just able politically, but able willingly to take on the unions, to reform the NHS, to bring the sort of public sector on side in a way the Conservatives couldn't do because of the politics of it. And so far they are fundamentally failing to do anything but the basics of what the health service should be providing. Where are the big, bold, reforming promises that they said wouldn't need more money before the election? And lo and behold, the chequebook's come out again.
Well, we need to invest in the NHS up front to deal with what is a national crisis.
Well, Keir Starmer said no money before reform.
No, but this was, as the Chancellor set out in the budget, and Keir Starmer has said, this is a down payment on reform. What we can't do is we can't say to patients, hold on, can you just wait for your operation? We're going to do some reforms. We have to get the NHS working urgently, and that's why it was absolutely necessary to put investment in the budget. Now, I think Harry's being a little harsh on Wes Streeting. Today, we've announced one of the... I'm sure he would appreciate that. But one of the announcements today is a big deal with the private sector. Now, that is a big, important step about increasing NHS capacity, using the private sector, because we're not going to put ideology ahead of what works in the NHS. And that is something that I think is right for the NHS to deal with this a massive backlog of nearly 8 million people waiting for surgery. There is, for treatment, sorry. There is more to do. Lord Darcy's review is still ongoing. He's done his interim report. That work is still ongoing. We need to see what comes out of that. And there's a bill coming as well this year as well. So, still early days.
But actually, Rachel's point, isn't all of this, whether it's low-hanging fruit, whether it's not very ambitious or it's too ambitious or whatever it is all undermined by the fact that this government, like previous governments, is pushing the issue of social care and how that is to be funded into the long grass. It's not going to come back with interim recommendations until 2026, next year now, and then finally in 2028. We've been waiting years.
Yeah. Well, we have been waiting years, but the problem is there hasn't been an answer to this problem which is able to sort out the social care crisis.
Yeah,
now,
that will undermine everything else you're trying to do.
Wes Streeting has already taken steps to try and deal with social care in the first few months of a Labour government. He's undertaken... Well, he has, and he accepts there's much more to be done.
He's put a bit more money into it. But
that's quite important.
It is, I grant you, but the fundamental funding of it. Theresa May tried to do it. Well, that didn't go very well. Gordon Brown tried to do it before her. And that also didn't
I remember
succeed.
Boris Johnson on the steps of Downing Street saying he's going to get social care done, whatever that meant.
There was
and he didn't.
Pandemic, but to be fair.
But he also said he had a plan when the plan was to figure something out.
I think it's right that Dame Casey is going to do this report. The first report will come back next year now, and let's see what that comes out with.
I do think it's funny, though, this is, it is that the grooming scandal is basically the only inquiry that the Labour Party won't have. There's already been 3 inquiries into social care. What happened? And
Casey did a report on
one of my colleagues asked the Prime Minister this morning. Is what has happened? There's already been a review. What happened to your noble words earlier about this is the time for action? Enough of talking about it. Let's actually just get on with it.
Right.
Why does that not apply to this massive issue?
Well, Jake, you want to respond to them? We'll move on.
Dame Louise Casey, who's doing this review, has already done a review on grooming. I mean, that came out in 2014. I'm sure Harry's read it. I'm sure he's read it.
Well, something for him to read later on. Let me just show you this headline. It was some breaking news today in the Financial Times. Tulip Siddiq, who's the Labour's anti-corruption minister, refers herself to government advisor on ministerial standards. That's after being named in a financial corruption scandal in Bangladesh. It's in relation to her aunt, the former Prime Minister there, also being investigated. All of the accusations are denied by Tulip Siddiq and her aunt. Should she also step aside, Jake, from her ministerial role while this investigation is ongoing?
No, I mean, I think the process is the phrase is you invite yourself to be investigated by the...
Yes, she's referred herself.
Referred herself, that's the one I'm looking for.
Willing refer. Or was the Treasury's got bored of asking questions?
Let's not challenge the motivation. It's been done, yes.
And that process has now started, and that is important it takes place.
Right, so she shouldn't step aside. All right, we're going to talk briefly about the economy because we've spoken for so long about all the other issues. Let me just show you this in BBC News. Firms to raise prices due to tax and wage increases. The British Chambers of Commerce have said that some of its members are planning to raise prices in the next 3 months as they face what they call a pressure cooker of rising costs and taxes. Still, the impact of your first budget. Has the Chancellor misfired?
Well, look, these were difficult decisions. No one wants to raise tax on businesses and small businesses in any way. But I'm not quite sure what the alternative was. The IFS have said that themselves. Well, the public finances were...
What the IFS says was there was a conspiracy of silence and you shouldn't have boxed yourself in by ruling out any tax rises on the three main levers of tax. You're nodding as well, John. That was exactly what they said about the Conservatives.
But we didn't win the election. We didn't implement these
you told the same side.
You maxed out the credit card on the way out the door.
And you did decide to cut national insurance by 2p at the last minute when everyone knew that was completely unaffordable. Conservatives shouldn't have done it, and Labour shouldn't have committed to...
But Joe, there is a serious point here. What is the counterfactual?
It.
If we didn't take this difficult decisions on national insurance for businesses, what is the counterfactual here? How would we pay for the £22 billion for the NHS? How do we deal with the public finances, which is critical to having a secure economy, which helps businesses in the medium and long term?
Maybe you should have said that in the election or something that alluded to it.
But there was another way of doing it.
Oh, yeah.
The budget has essentially spared the city and the banks and the and high finance, so to speak, and it's put the burden on the employer, be that someone who employs a couple of people in a small business, or a big employer like big supermarkets or dare I say news organisations. Everyone's costs are going of employing people, jobs. There's the reason they call it a jobs tax. Both sides call it a jobs tax when they don't. When the other side does it, is it genuinely does hamper really does hit employment, and that's what people are raising the alarm about. Is there's all these massive expansion plans they may have had are now on ice because they've just got to spend the same amount of money they could have expanding just to be standing still.
Well, and this is really the sort of flavour of this headline in the Times. Small businesses plan layoffs over employment rights bill. This is another key bill by the government. Federation of Small Businesses said the bill will mean companies will cut back on hiring and ditch investment plans. The problem is, Jake, where are you going to get your growth from?
Well, just on that particular issue, we went into the general election promising the biggest upgrade in workers' rights in a generation, and we're delivering on that. Yeah. And I remember similar fears...
the accumulation then of tax rises and increases in national minimum wage, which may all be correct, but what I'm saying is that has been the impact.
You're talking about the workers' rights bill and employment rights bill, which is really important. Now, I was about to say, I remember in 1997 when we introduced the national minimum wage, and there were similar fears, and of course unemployment didn't go up in anywhere as the scaremongering that the Conservatives...
But my question is, where's your growth going to come from?
Well, the most important element to getting a growth plan is having stability in the economy. And that is why these difficult decisions on tax, no one wants to raise taxes to try and be unpopular. It's not something that politicians kind of lend themselves to do, but we've done it because we have to get the country's finances stable, and that will get the country going in the medium term. Yes, it's difficult. I'm not pretending that it's not for a moment, but that's the only way that you deal with these issues in the medium and long term. Getting rid of plaster politics and starting to deal with the fundamentals of our country.
Right. Well, I mean, high tax and sluggish growth, that's what the Conservatives were all about.
So I think that the problem that we have now with the new administration is...
Well, never mind about that. What about that's true, isn't it?
As well as the higher taxes, the eye-watering tax hikes, the employment rights, which you've referred to, the narrative from the government has been doom and gloom. They have talked the British economy down. There's lots of people ahead of the budget were very worried about what the budget was going to contain. Rightly, they were very worried afterwards.
So you think people's confidence...
It's a spiral of doom. Whereas in the early part of the year, whether you agreed with them or not, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, there was a growth in the economy and things were much more optimistic. The businesses in my constituency were feeling much more bullish than what they are now.
There was an uptick in growth, but it was after 14 years of pretty anaemic growth overall. And you talk about confidence.
Fastest growing economy in the G7.
By the end of the Conservatives being in office.
Which is not now.
But just now, would you reverse those hikes in national insurance contributions?
As we've discussed earlier, we're not in an election campaign just now. We will set out our manifesto. Our job is to hold the government to account. We are a strong opposition. I remember my time in the Scottish Parliament very clearly holding the SNP administration to account. That is the job of opposition, asking the tough questions and holding the government to account. We will put forward our policies when the election is called.
I'm afraid we've run out of time.
Basically saying it's somebody else's problem.
It's like a game show, isn't it? That's all we have for today, but I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. A belated Happy New Year from all of us to you. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.